It's about the brutal geometry of how unfair life can be, just when I met the love of my life. It's about holding a hand that's slowly growing cold and realizing that the most powerful man in the world was also the most fragile. I promised him I wouldn't leave, but promises are easy when you don't know the price to pay. The hospital room was suddenly too small, suffocating with unspoken grief, and I needed to escape, if only for a moment. I went to the small, cold window, pressing my forehead against the glass, trying to cool the intense burn behind my eyes. John watched me, his silence a heavy blanket of understanding, knowing I couldn't bear to see his pain any longer. I thought of the first time I felt this overwhelming need to protect him, long before the illness. It was my second week as his assistant. He had been merciless with the portfolio, shouting numbers that sounded like a foreign language to me. Then his face went white, a sudden, alarming pallor, and he gripped the edge of his massive oak desk. I rushed to him, not with a file, but with a glass of water, my corporate fear instantly replaced by human concern. He met my gaze, and for the first time, the Ice King wasn't cold. He was just a man caught off guard. "It's nothing," he'd snapped, regaining his composure. But his voice had wavered, planting the first tiny seed of doubt in my mind about his supposed invincibility. It was in that shared fleeting moment of human weakness that the line between employer and employee had invisibly dissolved. The memory felt sharp and clear, like a knife twisting in my heart, knowing that moment was the beginning of our end. I turned back to him now, noting the way his hospital gown hung loosely on his shoulders, emphasizing his devastating weight loss. He was so thin, so fragile, a stark contrast to the imposing figure of my memories. "I'm calling the house. I need to make sure your jazz records are ready for when you come home," I lied gently, pretending the future was certain. He gave a faint, wry smile, the one that had always made my knees weak. That smile was a dagger, reminding me that even here, in the cold grip of a terminal diagnosis, his love was my only anchor. The money, the empire, the power, it all meant nothing against the ruthless simplicity of the disease. My whole life now revolved around these small, desperate acts of care. I knew the fight was futile, but stopping was never an option. We were caught in this brutal loop. Home, hospital, home again, and every trip felt like losing a little more of him. I returned to John's bedside, the phone call to the empty house having done nothing to ease the weight in my chest. He was staring at the ceiling, his breathing shallow, and I knew he was slipping back into the self-imposed isolation that the illness intensified. He didn't want pity. He wanted to be the man who conquered everything, even if that conquest was only in his own mind. I moved the IV pole slightly, the cold metal clang echoing too loudly in the small space, and pulled my chair closer. "Do you remember the day you finally admitted you liked the poetry I left on your desk?" I asked softly, a deliberate attempt to break his silence and anchor him to a beautiful memory. It was a risky move, pushing past his carefully constructed walls. He finally turned his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It was a reminder of the quiet, unexpected tenderness that first blossomed in the heart of his corporate war zone, a rare moment of vulnerability he had accidentally shown me. I'd secretly left a book of Yeats on his immaculate desk, a silent challenge to the man who only read financial reports. Weeks later, I found the book tucked into his briefcase, dog-eared on a page about fleeting beauty. "I don't need your romantic nonsense, Sarah," he'd growled, avoiding my eyes, "but I need you to order 3 more copies for research." That was John's way of confessing a feeling, always disguised as an order. The simple, hidden truth of his romantic soul had melted my defenses completely. Now, here in the hospital, the admission was simpler, but far more painful. "I remember, Sarah," he whispered, his voice catching slightly. "You always saw what I tried to hide." His honest admission was a brutal, beautiful gift. I squeezed his hand, memorizing the fragile bone structure beneath his skin. He was giving me his truth, one painful sliver at a time, knowing we had no time left for corporate games. His confession, however brief, was a powerful sign that he trusted me with his soul. I knew then that every single fight we had endured was worth this moment of raw connection. We weren't fighting the world anymore. We were fighting the inevitability of the disease side by side. But the real threat wasn't just the cancer. It was the secret reason he hid his diagnosis from everyone else, including his family. John's eyes, usually so sharp and focused, were heavy with fatigue, the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. He took a few shallow breaths and then looked directly at me, a rare, unmasked vulnerability in his gaze. "You need to know something, Sarah. Something about why this has to stay a secret." His voice was barely a whisper, forcing me to lean in, the floral scent of my own perfume suddenly clashing with the sterile air around us. The weight of his impending confession felt enormous, threatening to crush the small bubble of love we had built. I'd recalled a vicious late-night phone call he took months ago, before the diagnosis was confirmed. He was arguing with someone over a massive secret charitable donation, a large sum of money diverted from his trust. He ended the call trembling, his anger a visible radiating force. "Don't ever ask me about my finances again, Sarah. There are promises I made a long time ago." His command was absolute, hiding a profound pain I couldn't understand then, but the tremor in his hands betrayed his powerful composure. Now, in the hospital, he confessed the truth. The empire, it wasn't just built on ambition. It was built on a promise to my father to protect this company no matter the cost. "My disease," he paused, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "It triggers a clause in the trust. If the board knows I'm incapacitated, they'll force my hand and everything I worked for will be divided." He closed his eyes, his brow furrowed in shame, admitting that even now his duty was still tied to the fear of failure. I held his hand tighter, understanding that his legacy was the final battlefield. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of losing the control that defined his entire existence. The weight of his promise became the heaviest thing in the room, trapping us both. His fear wasn't about the money, but about failing his father's memory. This was the core of the powerful solitude I had always sensed around him. "I won't let them take it, John. We'll protect your legacy," I promised, the words cementing my transition from assistant to co-conspirator. My commitment now extended far beyond love. It was a desperate vow to honor his dying wish. I was prepared to fight the entire corporation and his circling family if it meant giving him peace. I remembered the night we confessed our love. A sudden, violent storm trapped us in his apartment, the rain pounding against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He held me tightly, his heart pounding in a frantic, powerful rhythm against my ear. "I love you, Sarah Hilton," he finally admitted, the words escaping his control, tasting of electricity and vulnerability. That night, the loud sound of the rain outside only amplified the silence and heat of our shared secret inside. Back at the hospital, the only sound was the sterile hiss of the oxygen machine. I leaned in close, my cheek pressed against his, trying to infuse him with my own warmth, my life force. The sharp angles of his face, now much more pronounced, pricked my skin gently, a physical reminder of the suffering that consumed him. I could smell the subtle, metallic scent of the medicine clinging to his skin, overpowering the faint, cherished memory of his cologne. "Tell me about the Italian villa, John," I whispered,
referring to the reckless dream trip we'd planned during a brief moment of hope before the diagnosis became terminal. I needed to hear his voice, hear him believe in a future, even if it was a lie we both knew. He opened his eyes, and a flash of the old dominant John, the man who commanded his desires, returned. "It has to be the Amalfi Coast," he said harshly, his eyes burning with a sudden, intense heat, trying to conjure the image for both of us. Sunlight, not snow, and no cell phones, just you and the sound of the sea. His voice trailed off again, the effort proving too much that the love in his gaze was a final, fiery declaration. That brief glimpse of his powerful self, the passion that could still ignite dreams, was enough to destroy me completely. I knew that I could soon lose John, but I still had hope that he would be cured. John was awake, watching me, his eyes sharp with an unnerving intensity that contradicted his weakened state. He noticed the tremor in my hands as I adjusted the blanket, and his jaw tightened. He reached up, his fingers weakly grasping my wrist. "Don't look at me like that, Sarah," he ordered, his voice thin but carrying the ghost of his former authority. "I don't need your pity. It's the one thing this disease won't take from me." His demand was a cruel, necessary defense. He needed me to see the man, not the victim, but it tore at my soul. I knew that accepting his command meant swallowing the overwhelming wave of grief and despair I felt every second I watched him suffer. It was an act of profound, agonizing love to constantly hide my fear, to present a facade of unwavering strength when all I wanted was to break down and beg the universe for mercy. I remembered the morning he collapsed in the hallway, an episode he insisted was just fatigue. When I tried to call an ambulance, he stopped me, his face inches from my own, his eyes blazing. "If you ever compromise my control, Sarah, it's over. You tell anyone, you bring this weakness into the light, and I walk away from you for good." The threat wasn't about the job. It was about the fear of becoming reliant. I had chosen love then, concealing his sickness, and now I was paying the cost. I gently moved my wrist from his grasp, maintaining the fierce resolve he demanded. "I'm not pitying you, John. I'm admiring you. You're fighting a battle that no amount of money or power can win, and you're still dictating the terms." The words were true, but they were also the loving lie he needed to hear to maintain his fight. The corners of his mouth softened, a slight, almost imperceptible acknowledgement that I had given him the dignity he craved. The tension in the room eased slightly, replaced by a quiet understanding of the monumental sacrifice required of us both. He sacrificed his pride by allowing me to care for him, and I sacrificed my sanity by watching him fade. My devotion wasn't a choice anymore. It was the only air I could breathe. The simple, shared act of defiance against the inevitable was the most intimate thing we had ever done. But I knew this desperate strength could not last forever, and the end was closer than either of us wanted to admit.
The exhaustion in the room was a tangible presence, pressing down on us both. John closed his eyes, his breathing finally settling into a fragile, measured rhythm. Watching him sleep was the only time I allowed myself to fully grieve. I looked at the stark white sheets, contrasting sharply with his pale skin, and was instantly transported back to the vivid warmth of our first weekend away, a stolen memory that now felt like a desperate dream. It was 6 months after I started, a sudden, reckless decision to escape the city. We drove north until the skyline disappeared, ending up at a secluded cabin near a lake. He was wearing jeans and an old sweater, shedding the armor of the CEO completely. We stood on the porch, watching the sun set over the dark water, and he turned to me. His eyes no longer steel, but melted blue. "I can't believe I waited this long to be just us," he admitted, his voice raw. He kissed me then, and the kiss wasn't urgent or stolen. It was a total surrender, a declaration that tasted like sweet freedom and the certainty of a destiny we couldn't outrun. That weekend was the genesis of our tragedy.
the moment we tasted a perfect love we knew the world would never sanction. I ran my thumb gently over his knuckles now, remembering the strength of his hands as they held mine by the lake. The pain of the past perfection against the present decay was almost unbearable. I had to focus on the love, not the loss. He stirred slightly, not waking, but a faint, almost imperceptible frown creased his brow. A reflection, perhaps, of some deep-seated discomfort. I leaned down and whispered the title of the jazz song we danced to that night by the cabin fireplace. It was a secret language only we shared, a comforting, silent lullaby meant to pull him back from the edge of his physical pain. His breathing smoothed out almost immediately. He was listening. Even in the depths of his medicated sleep, it was a beautiful, devastating testament to the power of our connection. Our love was physically soothing him, a final beautiful defiance against the disease. The delicate rhythm of John's sleep gave me a moment to breathe, but it also offered an unbearable opportunity to observe the devastating toll the disease had taken on him. I reached over to touch his hand again, and this time my fingers brushed against a small, rough scar near his wrist, partially hidden by the hospital band. It was a detail I hadn't noticed before, a small pale line, contrasting sharply with the faint bruising from the needles. It was a physical mark that spoke of a hidden history, making my heart ache with renewed curiosity and dread. During that perfect weekend at the cabin, while we were dancing slowly to the jazz by the fireplace, I had traced the outline of his muscular arms. I felt a different scar then, a deeper, older one on his shoulder, and I asked him about it. His sudden reaction was terrifying. He pulled away instantly, the joy draining from his face like water. "Don't ask about that, Sarah," he commanded, his voice dark and edged with a pain that had nothing to do with finance. "It's a mistake I already paid for." The abrupt shift in his mood had been a sharp, cold reminder of the vast, unexplored territory of his past. Now, looking at the tiny scar on his wrist, I realized the secrets weren't just corporate. They were deeply personal, rooted in a hidden trauma that had clearly defined the guarded man he became. I wondered if the weight of this unseen history contributed to the relentless stress that perhaps years later had manifested as this cruel illness. This thought was a devastating blow, suggesting our love wasn't just fighting cancer, but the ghosts of his past. I carefully adjusted the thin blanket around him, my eyes blurring with tears. I knew he hid his pain because he believed that weakness invited exploitation, and he couldn't bear to lose my respect. But here, in the cold reality of the hospital, all his walls were meaningless. My love wasn't conditional. It was a fierce, protective fire, burning away all the unnecessary secrets he had carried for so long. I whispered, my voice thick with emotion, "I don't care about the mistakes, John. I only care about the time we have left." He stirred, a muscle twitch in his cheek, proving he heard the depth of my commitment.
The air in the hospital room had been thick and suffocating for weeks, so when the doctor surprisingly agreed to a brief afternoon outside, a wave of profound, desperate relief washed over me. I helped John carefully out of the bed, the sight of his gaunt frame a familiar, painful ache in my chest. He was wearing his own clothes, a soft cashmere sweater, which momentarily restored a shadow of the powerful man I fell for. The simple act of smelling his familiar cologne again ignited a desperate flicker of hope within me. I remembered the day I wore a new dress, a delicate shade of blue. John, usually oblivious to anything but profit margins, had stopped in the doorway of his office. He hadn't said a word, but his eyes, slow and deliberate as they swept over me, conveyed a burning intensity that made my skin flush. Later, he'd placed a single blue gardenia on my desk with a note that read simply, "Matches your eyes."
It was the first time I realized his attention was a form of silent, intoxicating devotion, and it melted away the intimidation I felt toward him. As we moved through the sterile corridors, pushing his wheelchair, John's hand found mine, resting on the chair's armrest. The sudden warmth of the spring sun hitting his pale face in the hospital garden made him close his eyes in what looked like pure, fragile bliss. The garden was an explosion of color and scent, roses, jasmine, a beautiful, living contrast to the antiseptic white world we'd been trapped in. He looked at me, a real, unmasked smile stretching his lips, and for the first time in months, I saw the John Wilson who was simply happy to be alive, happy to be with me. "This," he whispered, squeezing my hand, "this is the Amalfi Coast, Sarah. This is all we need." His voice was faint, but the depth of emotion behind the words was overwhelming. A final, beautiful affirmation that our love transcended the grand settings he was known for. We sat in that fleeting sunlight, silent, simply existing in the glow of our precious borrowed time. It was a perfect, heartbreaking moment of ordinary beauty. But the beautiful fragility of that afternoon was a cruel reminder that their time was a countdown they couldn't stop. The glow of the stolen afternoon in the garden faded quickly, replaced by the cool reality of the hospital room and the crushing weight of time. I sat beside John, tracing the outlines of his lips as he drifted in a light sleep. It was a face that held a world of potential, a future we had only ever dared to whisper about, a future that now felt brutally impossible. The silence of the room was heavy, echoing the unsung lullabies of the children we would never have. We were lying in bed, tangled together, safe from the corporate demands and his secrets. I remembered casually mentioning seeing a young family at a park that day, and John had gone completely still. "He'd have a boy," he murmured, his voice thick with uncharacteristic emotion. "Your spirit, Sarah, and my stubbornness." It wasn't just a fantasy, it was a deeply rooted desire, a vulnerability he rarely showed. We spent the next hour mapping out a ridiculous, wonderful future filled with scraped knees and bedtime stories. It was the moment I realized our love was meant to be foundational, meant to last for generations. I watched him now, and the memory pierced my heart with a fresh, sharp agony. The dream of a child was the ultimate sign of his commitment to me, a testament to the fact that he saw forever in our brief time together. Knowing that the disease was not only taking him, but also annihilating the lineage he desperately wanted to create, felt like the cruelest joke of fate. The cancer was stealing our past, our present, and our entire future. He woke slowly, meeting my tear-filled gaze. He didn't ask why I was crying, he simply knew. He lifted his hand, weakly wiping a tear from my cheek. "Don't mourn what never was, my love," he whispered, his voice catching. "Mourn only that our time was too short for the perfect one." His compassion in his own suffering was an unbelievable testament to his character. The profound tragedy of their unfulfilled dream hung in the air, a silent, beautiful devastation. John was still weak, but the mention of their lost future had sparked a desperate protective fire in his eyes. He squeezed my hand, his gaze intensely focused, trying to convey a lifetime of unspoken words. I knew his longing for a child wasn't just about legacy. It was about healing an old wound. I had only ever seen the confident, self-made man, but I sensed a deep emptiness he'd never allowed me to touch. That weekend at the lake, after he'd shut down my question about the old scar on his shoulder, he had retreated to the balcony. I found him there later, staring out at the water, looking heartbreakingly young and lost. He hadn't asked because he felt guilty. "My father," he'd finally confessed, his voice barely audible above the wind. "He taught me everything about building, but nothing about being a man. He valued success over everything. I wanted to be a better father than he ever was." The admission was fleeting, but it revealed the profound trauma of his childhood and the driving force behind his ambition. In the hospital room now, the realization hit me with devastating clarity. His empire was built not just on ambition, but on the desperate desire to prove his worth. And the dream of a son was his chance to break the cycle of coldness. The disease was stealing his opportunity to rewrite his own story, which was a tragedy far beyond simple loss. "We did break the cycle, John," I whispered, resting my head carefully on his chest, listening to the frail, uneven beat of his heart. "You taught me how to love without condition. That is a legacy greater than any child or any company." I felt the slight shudder of his thin body, a silent acceptance of my truth, which was the purest form of love he could offer. He shifted his weight and gently ran his fingers through my hair, a gesture that was both intensely loving and heartbreakingly final. His touch was weakening, and I mentally screamed, trying to burn the feeling into my memory. This profound, unspoken intimacy in the face of death was the essence of our entire brief relationship. He was losing his life, but in these final desperate moments, he was finally winning the battle for his soul. But I knew the beautiful surrender to love meant he was finally ready to face the truth he'd been avoiding about his physical pain.
The quiet stability of the hospital room shattered without warning. John, who had been resting peacefully, suddenly arched his back, a low, guttural sound tearing from his throat, his face contorted in a terrifying mask of pain. The color instantly drained from his lips, and his frail body began to shake violently against the pillows. His grip on my hand, which moments before had been so gentle, became a vice of desperate, unimaginable agony. My blood ran cold, fear paralyzing my lungs. I remembered one night, after a battery of discouraging tests, when John had been uncharacteristically vulnerable. He'd leaned against the window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. "I'm not afraid of being dead, Sarah," he'd admitted, his voice rough. "I'm terrified of the pain, of losing control when it finally comes." His confession had been a stark, raw plea for courage, and I had promised him, silently, fiercely, that I would be his anchor. Now, as I frantically reached for the nurse call button, screaming for help, I saw the fear he had admitted to, magnified 1,000 times, reflected in his wide, terrified eyes. The room erupted into chaos as nurses and doctors rushed in, surrounding his bed, obscuring him from my sight. I was pushed back, an agonizing bystander forced to watch the love of my life lose his final, terrifying battle for control. Through the chaos of beeping machines and urgent voices, John locked eyes with me one last time. He fought the pain, fought the drugs they were administering, just to speak. His voice was a barely audible, broken whisper, but the meaning exploded in my soul. "Promise me," he gasped, his eyes filled with a heartbreaking pure love. "Promise me, you'll find happiness. Find someone who can give you the children we dreamed of. Don't stop living, Sarah. Live for us both." His request, his final act of selfless love, felt like a devastating wound, a command I was entirely unprepared to obey. He was telling me to erase him, to move past the love that had defined my life. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that his heart was breaking, not from the pain, but from the realization that he had to set me free. John's desperate request to live and find love for them both echoed in the chaotic hospital room, a devastating sound that cut through the urgent medical commands. I was numb, my focus locked on his face, watching the exhaustion finally win the battle over his fierce will. His eyes fluttered shut, his last conscious act a sacrificial surrender of my future. The doctors, now in control, quickly stabilized him, but the damage was done. His request was the most selfless and the most cruel gift he could ever give me. I remembered waking up in the cabin, the morning after we first confessed our love. John was already awake, watching the sunrise over the lake, his profile silhouetted against the dazzling light.
He reached for my hand, pulling me close. I never believed in fate, Sarah, but you make me want to believe in a beautiful, long future. That moment, so full of fragile hope and genuine surprise, was the foundation of my belief in our forever. The promise he asked for now shattered that image, demanding I trade a shared eternity for a lonely future. I was finally allowed back to his bedside. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the soft hiss of the ventilator, the machine now breathing for the man who once controlled the oxygen in every room he entered. I took his hand, lifting it gently to my lips, pressing a kiss to the bruised skin above his IV port. His hand felt cooler now, the fragility more pronounced, but I felt the weight of his love in the stillness. I can't promise that, John, I whispered against his skin, tears finally flowing freely, soaking his sheet. My life is with you. It began with you. My refusal wasn't defiance. It was the raw truth of my heart. He was asking me to tear out a vital piece of my soul and pretend it never existed. I wouldn't do it. I would cherish the memory and the promise of his happiness, but I couldn't discard our love for a new one.
The chaos subsided, replaced by an even more terrifying quiet. The doctors, their faces grim, delivered the news. The aggressive treatment had failed, and there was nothing more they could do. John was stable, but the next few hours would be their last. The truth felt like a physical blow, freezing the air in my lungs. I dismissed the medical team, needing the final moments to be solely ours, sacred and silent. I remembered the day John confessed his disease to me, not with tears, but with a terrifying stillness. He simply handed me the file and said, "This is it, Sarah. This is the only thing I can't fix." I'd grabbed his shirt, pulling him to me, burying my face in the expensive cloth, sobbing not for the future, but for the beautiful, impossible present we were about to lose. His arms, for the first time, held me tight, an act of sheer, desperate clinging. I sat back by his bedside, the chair cold and hard beneath me, a contrast to the fierce warmth of our memory. His face was impossibly pale, his lips slightly parted, and the rhythmic sound of the ventilator was the final mechanical heartbeat of our relationship. I took his hand, lifting it to my mouth, not caring that the skin felt thin and cold, almost like porcelain. I whispered every promise I had made to him, every memory we shared, every unsaid "I love you" into the quiet room, trying to fill the impending void with the sheer force of my devotion. As the clock ticked toward midnight, I leaned in closer, my ear near his mouth, hoping for a final breath, a final word. His breathing grew shallower, the pauses between each mechanical pump lengthening with an agonizing slowness. I watched the monitor, the green line of his heartbeat undulating, growing flatter, weaker, until it became a fragile thread I wanted to reach out and hold together. I felt a sudden, final, convulsive squeeze from his hand, a small burst of the powerful man he once was. He looked at me, his eyes wide, and his gaze was filled with a lifetime of love and regret, before they went utterly still. The sudden, piercing, flatline tone of the monitor was the sound of my world ending. I was no longer Sarah Hilton, his love. I was just a woman left alone with a cold hand and an unbearable silence. The unbearable geometry of loss. The sound of the flatline was not just a noise. It was a physical tearing, splitting my heart in two and shattering the fragile piece of the room. I screamed. Not a cinematic scream, but a raw, animalistic cry of profound, unbearable agony that felt ripped from the very core of my soul.
I threw my arms over his still body, clinging to him desperately, trying to breathe my life back into his. The scent of his familiar cologne was already fading, giving way to the cold, undeniable odor of death. I remembered the sound of his pure, unrestrained laughter, a rare, magnificent sound the night we were alone at the cabin. He had told a terrible joke, and we both dissolved in tears of mirth. I pressed my ear against his chest now, searching for any echo of that sound, any sign of life. But there was only a profound, silent emptiness where his magnificent heart used to beat. The nurses moved gently, professionally around me, their kind voices distant and meaningless. They tried to ease me away, but I held on fiercely, my body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. I pressed a final, desperate kiss on his lips, which were already cooling, losing the warmth that had been my anchor for 2 years. This was the terrifying loss of control he feared, and it was happening to me, not to him. "You can't leave me," I choked out, the words catching in my throat. "You promised me the coast, John, the sun and the sea. You can't leave me here alone." My tears poured on his white gown, staining the fabric, a desperate final offering of my grief. The entire world outside that small hospital room ceased to exist. There was only the crushing weight of his absence, the cold, heavy reality of his still hand in mine. The beautiful, intense, impossible love we had fought for, concealed, and finally cherished in the face of death was over. But the real challenge was not the dying. It was learning to live again with the final, enduring request he had left me.
The hospital room had been emptied of its medical urgency, leaving only the profound, cold stillness of loss. John's body was gone, but his presence was a heavy, suffocating weight that refused to lift. I walked through the empty corridors, the sterile air now tasting like ash. His final request, to live for both of us, to find a future and have the children we dreamed of, was an impossible burden, a cruel act of love that demanded my complete emotional undoing. I remembered the day, just before his last hospitalization, when he was still strong enough to walk out of his office. He had stopped at the door, turned, and just looked at me, a gaze so full of fierce pride and unspoken love that it felt like a silent goodbye. That look was his final order, to be strong. Now I felt his spectral presence pushing me toward the light, even as my own heart begged to stay in the darkness with him. I returned to his empty apartment, the place where we had built our secret, beautiful world. The scent of his favorite cologne still lingered in the air, a devastating ghost. I fell onto the silk sheets of his bed, clutching the cashmere sweater he wore in the garden, and sobbed until exhaustion claimed me. The silence of the vast, luxurious space was no longer protective. It was a screaming void reflecting the emptiness in my soul. But in the quiet devastation of the morning, a sudden realization hit me, a small, cold detail I had overlooked during the chaos of his final hours. Something about the legal documents, the trust he desperately protected, and the unexpected visit from his lawyer. John had ensured his legacy was secured, but had he also ensured mine? The thought injected a single sharp shard of professional alertness into my grief. His promise demands I find a future, but first, I have to survive the wreckage of his past. The real fight for Sarah Hilton has just begun. John Wilson's love was the most beautiful thing I'll ever know. He asked me to live, to find happiness, to have the future he couldn't give me.
But how can you move forward when your heart is buried with the man you love? I'm broken, lost. But his final selfless wish is my only map. If this devastating love story, cut short by tragedy, has gripped your heart, then you cannot miss the next chapter. The journey through grief is brutal, but John's final legacy holds secrets I still haven't uncovered. Click the subscribe button and the bell notification now to follow Sarah's impossible path, honoring his promise, facing the vultures he left behind, and discovering the one final breathtaking surprise he left in his will. Will Sarah find the strength to love again? The answer is waiting in Part 2.